Welcome to Ask the Educator, a podcast brought to you by Healthmark Industries. Are you a sterile processing technician or manager? Maybe you work in infection prevention or biomedical engineering. Whether you're a frontline tech, endoscopy tech, OR nurse, or surgical services administrator, you undoubtedly have influence in medical device processing at your facility. In each episode, we speak with experts from the Healthmark Clinical Affairs team, industry leaders, or special guests from the trenches to answer your questions and bring you relevant industry information, equipping you for excellence in medical device processing. My name is Kevin Anderson, and I will be your host. Now let's get started. Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Ask the Educator podcast. This is Kevin Anderson, your host, and I have with me my co-host, Adam Okada. And joining us as our guest on this episode is Dr. Marianne Droznak. This podcast really is a follow-up to the international webinar that she just finished. We went over about surveillance testing, and with that, Marianne, welcome to the show. And just, if you would, explain a little bit about the history and rationale behind microbial surveillance as it pertains to flexible endoscope processing.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, and thanks everybody for joining us today. The history as to why microbial surveillance has come up is related to the reports that we saw many years ago, back to 2012 and maybe even before that, about reports of infection related to contamination remaining on endoscopes after they've been reprocessed. So we saw many of those outbreaks, or superbug outbreaks, as we called them, starting in that time period and continuing for a couple years. And then the first safety alert that we got from the FDA then was in August of 2015, where they recommended supplemental measures that enhanced duodenoscope reprocessing. So really risk mitigation strategies to be used when reprocessing duodenoscopes. And the first one on that list was culturing. So that's the first time we saw mention of that as a recommendation from the FDA. It had been used routinely as part of investigations in when an endoscope was suspected of being implicated in an outbreak. Then, of course, we would have cultured them even before that. But this is the first mention of, from the FDA at least, of culturing duodenoscopes to help cut back on that risk. And that was meant to be done on a routine basis. So that has stayed a recommendation from the FDA up through the 2019 safety alert that came out from them, is that if you are continuing to use traditional reprocessed endoscopes like we have been, that you implement the reprocessing and then the subsequent culturing of that to show that your reprocessing program is in a state of control. Really, it's a quality control or quality assurance mechanism. So that's stayed a recommendation, but it's a little overwhelming to facilities because, as I mentioned, it's labor intensive and time intensive and all of that. So a lot of facilities have taken the mentality like, well, we don't have the time to do it, or we don't have the people to do it. And some even as far as saying, we don't want to know. and that's the one that always hurts me is we don't want to know what we don't want to know. So maybe they haven't embraced culturing, but there are ways to do it now where it's more manageable.
I actually, if you don't mind, Adam, I have a follow-up question to this because it just sparked a thought in my mind when you were talking about that, and in reference to the early days and coming up with these cultures. One of the things I always questioned was what denotes like a negative culture test. So like we're primarily high level disinfecting these scopes, meaning they're not expected to be sterile. So when we culture them, we're expecting a positive culture, but at what point would it be a negative result? Does that make sense?
That's a great question. Yeah, it definitely is. And so by definition, sterile, you would expect to have no growth at all of anything. Whereas by high level disinfection, you'd expect no growth of our vegetative or typical bacterial cells, but we can't guarantee that all spores would be killed if they're there in a high number. What's odd about when we're looking at the reports of infection and the outbreaks is it's not with spore formers, it's with gram-negative bacteria that should easily be killed by our high-level disinfectants, and they're not being. So that's what's objectionable, Kevin, is if you have any gram-negative bacteria left over, those would be indicative of previous patient microorganisms being left over on the scope because they would be clinically relevant organisms, or that you have a problem with your water system. And we have gram negatives that love to live in water and can contaminate endoscopes because we don't do a good job drying them. Or, as I mentioned in the webinar, that you can have AERs that become contaminated. Water runs through them, and anytime you have water running in a consistent fashion, you can get biofilm develop. So it really can tell you more likely what's going on. But we do tolerate, I'll say, in the FDA method, it allows for low levels of low concern organisms. Those should also be killed by high-level disinfection, but they're more commonly contaminants from the air or from touching something that you shouldn't have touched when you're taking the sample, or they're talking when they're taking the sample, and we spit out a little saliva that has bacteria in it, and we artificially contaminate the sample. So there are caveats in there for low levels of low to mid concern organisms, but really by definition, all should be killed by high level disinfection.
That helps. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's really kind of the type of organism left behind that makes a difference. So yeah, excellent. Thank you. So Adam, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. And as you guys are talking, I'm just sort of like, as the SPD professional who's been really entrenched in SPD, I worked very briefly in a high-level disinfection area, but I'm hearing you guys talking about microbes and culturing and all these different things, gram-negative versus gram-positive and all that. This isn't really in sterile processing wheelhouse, right? I mean, if sterile processing professionals are supposed to be doing this is not really something they've been used to. So in the webinar, you also mentioned that the traditional culturing can take 2 to 3 people to actually get that culture done. Do you think that the complex science behind it, and then also the actual physical labor that goes into it, do you think that's the reason maybe this hasn't been done in the past?
Yes. Can I let it go with that? No, just kidding. I will. I will talk about that a little more, but yes, because of the cumbersome nature of the devices themselves being long and delicate, it's naturally hard to take the samples. And just like we have so many steps in reprocessing them, there's likewise many steps in trying to take samples from them. So you really need to have 2 to 3 people. So that's challenging in and of itself with the staffing levels that we're seeing in sterile processing. Adam, do you think most facilities would have 2 to 3 people that they could give up from their normal daily work to be able to take these samples? So we often see IP getting involved in it and helping to take the samples, and a lot of facilities who successfully implement cultures will have a super user who's trained that really knows how to take these samples in conjunction with IP, either helping take the samples or taking this. So working together really to do it right. And the most successful, if you're not using those newer methods like TFF that I talked about, if you're not using that, it's most successful when having 3 people do it. 1, 2 that stays sterile, clean, not really sterile because we're not in a sterile area, but you know what I mean. 1 that stays clean, 1 that opens things that's not clean, and then 1 that's reading the multitude of steps that you have to do. So that's the most successful way to do it in a clean area with all sterile items and PPE and all of that around you. You have to do this as clean to as sterile as you can to not have that contamination. And that really does hold facilities back from a staffing issue and a complexity issue too.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that was one of those things that I, when this whole thing came out, I was just wondering, how are people going to actually perform this test? And having 2 to 3 people makes a lot more sense. I wish I had the opportunity to see somebody do this in real time. But that being said, towards the end of the presentation, you had mentioned TFF, which is an alternative to the traditional culturing method, at least in terms of extracting a sample. So I'd like to at least get into that a little bit, because this is a newer development with us. And so I think it's really important that people know that this is available.
So it's something that we're introducing to the market right now, or very soon, I should say. But TFF is turbulent fluid flow. And what this is an enclosed system. So there's a box much like the size of an endoscope drying unit that we're used to seeing. In fact, this unit does have drying capabilities too, as an added benefit. But it is an enclosed system that you hook up sterile water to it in a syringe, and it flushes air into that water at a specific rate that's then injected into the endoscope, and it creates that shearing effect, or that contact with the lining or the channel itself, where we don't typically get a lot of flow when taking samples. So by doing it, it's an enclosed system. Everything we have when you're taking cultures is sterile, that touch the endoscope. So your sampling container and your sterile water and all of that, to help reduce that risk of contamination. And there's so much less manipulation that we're doing with the endoscope to get those samples out, that you have a decreased risk of contamination. And you have one person that sets it up and starts the process. It takes the sample and then you unhook it. So you only really need one person to do that. So by using TFF, you're taking enclosed, less risk of contamination, and you can test that sample that you're taking then for microbial surveillance. So you add your neutralizer right to it. You pick up then with that FDA culture method and test those then for bacteria, and then identify anything that grows. And I did touch on the much higher efficacy rates when using TFF for extraction, because you don't just have that simple laminar flow through the channel. You actually have that air embedded in the water, creating that shearing. So if there's things there like biofilm potentially, or just some low number of vegetative microorganisms, so regular bacteria, you're more likely to actually get them out using TFF than you would be with traditional sampling. So higher quality as far as the extraction rate goes, easier to use, less people. So it is, it is a technology that I think will catch on pretty quickly.
When I saw this, because I saw this for the first time at HSPA, and I was kind of got the demo and got a feel for what it is. Like, this is so much easier. Like as far as like all of those things we talked about and the complexities of it, this kind of simplifies it and gives you really a step-by-step process that one person can do. So I'm super excited about this. But
me too.
Yeah. Any kind of final thoughts you want to leave people with about microbial surveillance, or places to start, things like that?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. As I always say, I really just want facilities to think about it and don't dismiss doing endoscope sampling routine. Of course, you're going to do it in an outbreak setting or suspected outbreak, but routine microbial sampling, don't dismiss it because you think it's too complex or too much time. There are, as I said in the webinar, many facilities who have figured out a way to build this quality feedback mechanism in on a routine basis without disrupting things too much. So whether it be you figure out the interval that you're doing it, or you use TFF, or you do gram negative testing with the Now kit, the Now test, or you have more endoscopes, or you sample them less frequently, whatever it is, there are ways that you can implement microbial surveillance into your practices, reducing or minimizing the amount of disruption that it can have. Yes, there is going to be additional cost, and that's very variable depending on whether you're taking all the samples internally and sending that internally, or you're buying a kit, or you're purchasing TFF unit or the Now test. It's very variable of what the cost is going to be, but there are a variety of ways that you can implement something that is going to help to build that quality into your practices. There are too many reports now of culture positive with high concern organisms after reprocessing to ignore it or to think that it can't happen in your facility. And as I alluded to in the webinar, there are a lot of facilities that have been culturing, but not using good practice. They're not using neutralizer, or they're not letting their plates incubate for long enough. So they think that they have good practices because they always get zero growth. Well, I'll tell you, you don't always get zero growth on these. In fact, I would say as often you get growth on these samples as having no growth. And some of that time it'll be low concern organisms at a low level. So it's not something actionable, but sometimes you do get growth of gram-negative organisms, and that's huge. That shouldn't be there at any level. So you don't know what you don't know if you're not looking, and if you're not doing a high quality surveillance program and using the right methods and incubation times. So my advice is just to figure out a way you can do something. And we're always here to help, bounce ideas off of. And this is an area that I specialize in. So I'm always willing to work with facilities to try to, figure out what their options would be, or ways that they can implement some surveillance into their endoscope, specifically duodenoscopes. You always want to start with those, but we can do more into those programs.
Excellent. Thank you, Marianne. And great podcast follow-up to the international webinar. So I do want to remind everybody, if they happen to be listening to this before they got the chance to see the webinar, and you're thinking of other questions, they might be answered in that webinar. So please go back to hmark.com, check under the education tab for webinars, and you can view past webinars there. If you have further questions, definitely look at that as a resource. But as Marianne said, feel free to reach out to us here at HealthMark. You can reach out to your local rep if you have questions about TFF or the Now test, as Marianne talked about as well. Both are great options for you if you are interested in surveillance testing of any kind. So thank you for listening to the podcast. We hope you subscribe and continue to listen and continue to learn. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
All opinions expressed on this show are those of the presenters. Before using any medical device, it is important to review the device manufacturer's instructions for use.